Thank you. So a little bit of background. I think most everybody in this room knows this information, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Libfabric was introduced by OFI as a mechanism to provide a better network interface. I'm not going to say any more about that. If you want to look, it's out on the Libfabric page. By no means is this a condemnation of Libfabric, its design, or its designers. Rather, it is to share the experiences that we have had over the last little bit. And in fact, I'm very grateful for the community, for the OFIWIG, and for the contributors to Libfabric for providing what they've done, because I think it's a really good interface. Again, probably not going to spend too much time, but Libfabric is intended to be a high-performance, low-weight interface that is, at its core, network agnostic, meaning that it doesn't care what's underneath it as long as there's a provider for whatever network hardware that's running. And it's extendable. We've just heard about some of those extension capabilities. And before I really get into it, I want to offer a little bit of perspective on this. We are a hardware vendor. We have a network capability that's got some compelling performance characteristics. Our focus right now is on API level interfaces to the network. In other words, we're looking at a bunch of different ways of abstracting the actual underlying network hardware to support all of these application layer frameworks. I would consider Libfabric to be one of those type of frameworks. There's other open source efforts like Aaron. I can't think of any others at the moment. And then there's a bunch of commercial products that you find typically in the financial markets like 29 West, and there's a few others there. We are about 3 months into this. We don't have a releasable Libfabric interface yet. And by saying all of this, I also recognize that, you know, sometimes if you whine about it, you get the opportunity to go fix it. And so I'm willing to contribute anything we find back. And so this is not a gripe session or a whine session. I'm just wanting to share some experiences. So the overall impression that we have of Libfabric is that it has the hallmarks of a typical open source development effort. One of the biggest problems that we've run into is documentation. It's there. It is sometimes inadequate. It is not always accurate because the underlying code has changed and nobody's gone back and finished up the paperwork. And I've got a couple of examples of that. The roadmap is not always clear. There's a lot of moving pieces, and I know how difficult it can be to make sure that everybody understands what's going on. One of the examples that I have is that our first approach to develop a prototype provider was to go after the sockets interface, the TCP interface, only to learn a little bit later that that's being deprecated. Support is primarily by GitHub, mail reflectors, and individual contributors themselves. They've been, immensely helpful so far. And also from OFIWIG attendance, which we have not been really good at so far. The design we're finding is predominantly point-to-point. There is, multi-point reliable datagram capabilities. Since we have the capability of being inherently multicast, we're going to challenge Libfabric a little bit here pretty soon with trying to get better support for that. And what we have found is that much of the code requires pretty extensive reverse engineering to understand, exactly what's going on. And I've got a couple of examples of that. So let me move forward. What we are impressed with so far is the overall design. It's a very nice interface. It's extensible, like we just heard. It's relatively clean. It does have very nice verification tools with a couple of caveats. And it supports various addressing schemes. And again, this is all part of the network abstraction and the capability of supporting multiple network types, or the network agnostication, or agnosticism, I guess is really the correct term. The tools are good for initial verification. However, you got to be careful with them. We've run into a couple of cases where we have run some of the tests thinking that they're actually passing, and only to do a little bit more digging and discover that we have found a place where the verification test is actually doing nothing but reporting success, because something wasn't done there correctly. The other problem with the tools that we have found is that they seem to be primarily dependent upon TCP/IP addressing. So if you have alternate addressing schemes, it becomes problematic. Here is one of the things that we were talking about in terms of our code and documentation type issues. If you look at this data structure from fabric.h, there's a field in here called size. Well, if you go look at the documentation, especially this happens to come from the PHY endpoint man page, it starts out with the size of the context is the description. The size is specified as the minimum number of transmit operations that may be posted to the endpoint without operation returning PHY E again. However, what we found is that in this particular case, this value of size is silently raised to the next power of 2. Not really quite sure why it's doing that, but it does. And we believe that the term context is a little bit overused throughout the documentation. That could lead to confusion. And again, we all know how difficult documentation can be. And I recognize that. I've been in this business far longer than I care to admit to. And it's always a struggle to get really good documentation. But we all also need to recognize that if we're going to be successful, that some of these things we need to be able to address and move forward. So, where are we going from here? We are currently working to get our point-to-point functionality to work. And where I'm anticipating the biggest challenges moving forward is once we get to true multicast support and the ability to multicast through Libfabric. I believe that that's going to be a little bit of a challenge based on what we're seeing in the current design. And then, of course, we've got all of the integration and support issues that will follow along with that. So this went a whole lot faster than I thought it would, as usual. Questions, comments? No rotten tomatoes, please. Tom.
So your device supports, if you will, a subset of the RDMA, similar to the Amazon talk earlier. Is that a challenge with the Libfabric infrastructure?
Well, I didn't really comment on that right now because that's kind of where we're struggling at the moment. We have direct user memory to user memory capability in a kernel bypass mode. It is not verbs, and so we're having to do a little bit of extra work to get around some of the semantics and the constructs in Libfabric to
So you're not
get that to work.
re-implementing a verbs layer for your stuff?
No.
You're trying to glue it directly
No.
in? Good. Okay.
We've actually got a very nice API that is, I'm going to avoid drawing a comparison between verbs and our API, but we happen to like our API. It seems to be a little bit lighter weight than what you have to do with verbs.
I guess another question is IP addressing. You mentioned you don't use that. That's the case with lots of other protocols. They usually have an IP mapping thing. Why don't you just map to IP? Most applications think in IP too.
Interesting question. That's something that I am looking at right now. We started off this implementation with a slightly different mapping scheme or addressing scheme, primarily because of our multicast capabilities. But running into questions about, well, is that really the right thing to do or not? So we're looking at that.
Okay, I can see how multicast could definitely add some wrinkles.
Oh, it has some real interesting challenges when you start talking about IP addressing. So. Okay.
So why Libfabric? You listed a number of things that doesn't fit very well for you. Get out of it.
Well, so if you look at the application marketplace, the thing that I have found, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier in the presentation, depending upon where you're developing the application, you may have a different framework that you're developing to. Everybody today is trying to figure out how to abstract the nuances of the underlying network from the actual network. So you see lots of messaging layers, you see lots of network abstraction layers showing up out there. OFED and Libfabric are two examples that happen to be predominantly present in the HPC market. You start talking about Shemem and others in the HPC market as well. When you start talking to big data analytics, which was one of the talks we had earlier, you start looking at Netty and some of the other interfaces that are showing up in Java. Their whole goal in life is to abstract what's going on in the underlying network and being able to move data from point to point within a cluster. When you start talking about financial applications, you starting to see there's a couple of predominant open source. The one that I think probably right now, at least in my humble opinion, has one of the best opportunities of succeeding is a package called Aaron. It's actually developed by a couple of the former developers from 29 West. And then you start talking about commercially available packages like 29 West, and there's a few others out there. You can go out and look for them and find them. So what it really comes down to is that if you want to support the broadest application, you have to find whatever those customers are using and find a way to implement to it. And so that's what we're spending a great deal of our time doing right now, is focusing on the software interfaces that people are using for the various applications. Anything else? Thank you.